Passover. How should you observe it? Who can observe it? Let's talk about it. Hey, this is Off the Cuff, and I'm Steve from TorahFamily.org. Today, we're continuing our teaching series, Torah 101, a series covering topics that give the basics in how we can all pursue the Torah as given by Yahweh. This series is for new believers or even sharing with those who may be interested in learning these topics. Though we'll be making other teachings on this particular topic to discuss more detail. Today, we're discussing the basics of Passover and unleavened bread. First, I believe it's important to note that no one can literally obey any of the 3 feasts of Yahweh today. You heard me right. No one can literally obey them. We remember them the best we can, but we can't obey them. The command for the feasts are to go and appear before Yahweh at the temple, as seen here in Deuteronomy 16:16. Now, this can't happen until Yeshua comes and sets up the proper priesthood. And I say this because there will come a time when the ark and the tabernacle will come out again. When they do, the modern state of Israel will set everything up with their priesthood in place. Many will believe this will be the time to start obeying the sacrifices according to the scriptures. But the priesthood they establish will not be the priesthood of Yahweh. In fact, this is why we read what we do in Isaiah 66, verse 3, about the sacrifices they perform. The sacrifices that priesthood makes will be abominations to Yahweh. Isaiah 66 is all about the end times, starting off with the beginning of the tribulation, when they set up the tabernacle and begin the sacrifices. And it concludes with the second Exodus in the latter part of the chapter. But that's a completely different teaching in itself. The point to be understood here is that no one can truly obey the feasts of Yahweh right now. Thus, we remember them the best we can out of a desire to obey. You may want to consider our teaching, The Unbreakable Laws, for more on understanding why we can't obey some things in the Torah today. So in all of this, I ask you to please remember, we can't obey Passover and unleavened bread as commanded. While some will say you have to do this and well, you have to do that. Ultimately, those points are mute until Yeshua returns and restores our ability to properly obey it all. And there's no scriptures to say we're judged on how close we get it right. If we're unable to obey it all, and that's our situation today, you can't obey it at all. Thus, we do our best in remembering it as we look forward to the time we will be able to obey as commanded. Now, for what it's worth, our family normally remembers second Passover, and we have a teaching specifically addressing this. It's simply titled The Second Passover. You can see that teaching to learn why we do that. However, what we're addressing here will be looking at the biblical instructions given whether one chooses to remember first Passover or second Passover. The instructions are the same for both. All too often, it seems we tend to make things harder than they really are. So, what are we really supposed to do for Passover? To some degree, I understand the confusion. The instructions seems to be spread over several books. Now, we know many like to observe what is called the Seder Supper. When we first came to Torah, we had many friends who were observing this. As we were getting ready for our first Passover meal, I remember Angela asking me why we weren't doing the Seder Supper. I told her because, well, I don't see it in the scriptures. It's something that's filled with traditions. Now, I'm not opposed to traditions. In fact, I like traditions. But if I don't know where those traditions come from, well, I'm not sure I want to do them. Now, even though we can't obey everything given, what do the Scriptures give us regarding Passover and unleavened bread? There's debate with some on this topic. You see, we have the instructions given when they were in Egypt, and we then see other instructions given afterwards. Do all the commands given at the time in Egypt roll over to the times to be remembered afterwards? Let's take a look. But before we do, we need to remember that Passover is a meal, not a day. However, through tradition, the 14th day of the first month has become known as the day of Passover. Because of that, it also became traditionally known as the first day of unleavened bread. But for clarification, it's not the first day of unleavened bread. The first day of unleavened bread is the 15th day of the first month, and the 14th day is the day when the Passover meal is eaten in the evening. Now, let's read through the Exodus account and see what we find. When reading from Exodus 12 verses 1 through 5, we see the lambs are chosen on the 10th day of the month. One per family, or families can join together if one is too small. Verses 6 and 7 discusses the lambs being slaughtered and the blood placed on the door frames. Verses 8 and 9 show the lamb is to be cooked, but this is where I'd like to present something that many may not have considered. Many use verse 8 to say how we're to have lamb, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs. However, the Hebrew doesn't say bitter herbs. The word for herbs doesn't even exist in the text. In fact, it doesn't exist in any of the verses about the Passover meal. The Hebrew actually implies to eat the meat with bread of bitterness. Seriously. So, no herbs? The directions for this meal were specific and should have been followed exactly as given. That being the case, why don't the instructions include the word for herbs? I couldn't even find the word in the Greek Septuagint. Bitter herbs can definitely represent bitterness. We get it. However, the text doesn't mention herbs at all. So, instead of eating bitter herbs, it would seem the text would imply to eat the lamb and the unleavened bread of bitterness. When first hearing this, I know it can sound totally wrong. However, this goes in line with the Passover instructions given in Deuteronomy 16, which says, "Do not eat it with bread made with yeast, but for 7 days eat unleavened bread, the bread of affliction, because you left Egypt in haste, so that all the days of your life you may remember the time of your departure from Egypt." The unleavened bread is called the bread of affliction, which coincides with the bread of bitterness in the Exodus account. Again, Yahweh's instructions are specific. So, why isn't herbs specifically noted in the Passover instructions? We see the word for herbs mentioned here in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 39 and 40. If we see the word for herbs mentioned here, why don't we see it in the specific instructions for Passover? I sincerely believe it's because there were no herbs to be eaten. It's specifically addressing the bread of affliction as given here in Deuteronomy 16. All I can tell you is there's no instructions for Passover that specifically say herbs. It's assumed by all translators. In fact, I believe this tradition of bitter herbs could have actually come from the Seder supper itself. However, the bread of affliction is noted and goes in line with the word bitter in the instructions. Continuing, Verse 10 instructs no meat is to be left till morning. Verse 11 shows how it's to be eaten in haste and as if you are ready to run. Some say this is how we are to eat it still to this day, and I can see that reasoning. However, at the same time, these could be specific instructions for that specific Passover in Egypt. I'll show why in a moment. Verses 12 and 13 shows the judgment that would come that night. Verses 14 through 20 discusses how the Feast of Unleavened Bread is to be remembered. 7 days of bread without yeast. Yeast is removed from the house on the first day, even though tradition has many do so on the 14th day. Sacred assemblies are to be held on the 1st and 7th days with no work. It's to be a lasting ordinance. In verses 21 through 23, we see it put into motion. Please note, it's Yahweh who goes through the land that night, and the Hebrew says he will not bring destruction in their homes. Verses 24 through 28 shows how these instructions are to be followed when they enter the promised land. It's to be a reminder to the future generations. Verses 43 through 49 give the regulations for the Passover meal. So, these will be the requirements for once everything is restored under Yeshua. It's not for foreigners outside the community. All males must be circumcised. Eaten inside one house. No meat goes outside the house. No bones are broken. The whole community must celebrate it. From chapter 13, verse 3 on, we see a recap of how the Feast of Unleavened Bread is to be remembered. However, I believe it's important to note verse 9, where it says it's to be a reminder on our forehead that the law of Yahweh is to be on our lips. Passover and unleavened bread are also discussed here in Leviticus 23, verses 4 through 8, and discussed here in Numbers chapter 28, verses 16 through 25, and discussed here in Deuteronomy 16, 1 through 8. Please note verse 7 here is for those who ate the Passover with someone else in their home. So, they returned to their home the next morning. In all of these instructions in how to remember Passover and unleavened bread from the other books, meaning outside of Exodus, which happened in Egypt itself, we see so much repeated in the instructions. The details of the week without leaven, the assemblies on the first and last day, and even when to kill the lamb and how to prepare it. However, with all these specific instructions repeated over and over, we never see again the instructions of eating it in haste with your staff in hand. Thus, it would seem those specific instructions could have been for that night in Egypt only. But again, that's a debate that could go either way for some and will most likely need to be answered by Yeshua when he returns. That being said, here in Exodus 12:42, we definitely see a command that was given in Egypt that wasn't repeated in the other instructions. Exodus 12:42. Because Yahweh kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt. On this night, all the Israelites are to keep vigil to honor Yahweh for the generations to come. Now, this is very reminiscent of Yeshua's instructions to watch and pray as seen here in Luke 21:36, which can easily be rendered, watch now with everyone, time praying. With this command in Exodus 12, this can easily be the time, that being the appointed time, when Yeshua is telling his disciples when we should be praying to watch for things to start for his return. But that's a different teaching in itself. All I wanted to bring out was this is definitely a command that's given in the time of Egypt, but to be continued on throughout the generations to come. This is the foundation to Passover and unleavened bread. Don't make it harder than what it is. And don't stress if you don't get it right. He gives us grace to grow as we learn every year. So enjoy it. Remember it. Look for the meanings behind it. And we'll be covering that in more teachings down the road. Lastly, many times there seems to be confusion on just what it means to have no leaven in the house. To help with that, my wife Angela has a written teaching titled Yeast or Leavened. I'm sure it will help if you have questions on that topic. It's linked below. Well, that's all I have. Think about it. Pray about it. But more than anything, be a doer of the word and not a hearer only. Until next time, Shalom.